Hello and welcome to Whisky.com, where fine spirits meet. And today I'm having a lot of whiskey. No, I'm not gonna drink any of them today because I'm doing a bit of a knowledge video today. I'm sharing with you a bit of the knowledge about whiskey. And today it's about the different kind of whiskies. So it's what kind of different whiskies are there? What type of whiskies do we have on the market? And they are numerous. They are so numerous that I can't fit them all on the cask. I still have a few of them down here, but I will come to them later. And the first distinction about the type of whiskies that you have is where comes the whiskey from? And it's very different. There are countries that have really specific laws about whiskey, especially Scotland, Ireland, and United States of America. And these are the leading countries in terms of whiskey. Then we do still have international markets. The Japanese are the runners-up. Then we have Canada. They're also very old. They have Canadian whiskey. Then we have Indian whiskey. We have German whiskey. And we have a lot of other countries that kind of cling on to the whiskey hype. Let's start off with the Scottish whiskey. And the Scottish whiskey is the only whiskey that can be called Scotch. Yeah, Scotch stands for Scottish. And in the Scottish whiskey, we divide them between three main type of whiskies that are kind of the main type. They are there is the single malt Scotch whiskey, the blended Scotch whiskey, and there's a fourth type like blended and blended malt, and then there is the grain whiskey. First of all, the single malt whiskey, the name says it, it's only from one type of malt, and that's malted barley. In recent years, I think it's probably now a decade ago or half a decade ago, they changed it a little bit. Single malt has now stricter rules, and that means you have to distill it on pot stills. The pot stills are now a requirement. Back in the days, you could actually malt your whiskey, take everything from malt, and then produce a malt whiskey in your column still. There were a few distilleries that were affected by this. Loch Lomond has malt whiskey made on their stills, but they now have to call it blended malt, even though they could make it from one grain, from just malt. Now we come to the next category. It's blended Scotch whiskey. And blended Scotch whiskey, this here was the single malt, is just a normal Glenallachie single malt whiskey. Now I'm gonna stand it by the side. Next one is the blended malt. The blended malt is special because it doesn't have a distillery. It's a non-distillery product. There is no Johnny Walker distillery. There are many distilleries that provide to the master blender, to Jim Beveridge, and he blends from different distilleries a whiskey together to have the Johnny Walker blended Scotch whiskey. And so the blend has its advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantages, you can mix everything together. That is really not good and say, yeah, cool, we have this brand and there's a brand. There are certain brands that do that. Some of the cheaper Johnny Walkers are not as good as in quality as well. So, and there's a bit of an transparency where you get the whiskey from. Also, you are allowed to mix grain whiskey in it. Means not from malted barley, but from grain, not malted barley. So unmalted barley. And you can have the variation between a drop of another whiskey into a single malt that is then a blend, or you can have 50% of grain. And yeah, in Johnny Walker, it is said that it's roughly 30% malt whiskey, depending on what quality you have. Yeah, also Johnny Walker is a bit better because we know what distillery the company owns that makes it, so you can pretty much guess where the whiskey is coming from. Yeah. Then we have the specialty about the blended whiskey is the blended malt. It's the same, but it's only malt whiskey that comes into the blended malt. So it's a mixture between different malt distilleries that come together. But blended malt, you could actually use whiskey that comes from a column still. You don't have to, but you can. And the last category here is the grain whiskey, here represented by the granary made by the malt man. I love it that the malt man does the grain whiskey. Okay, so the grain whiskey is a whiskey that is made 100% of grain and comes from one distillery. So straightforward, what you have with the single malt, you have with the grain. And there would be is a certain type. It's called you can either have a blended grain whiskey, which is blended from different grains together, or a single grain whiskey, which would be a distillery, a whiskey from one distillery. I'm not sure if a single grain whiskey would also be categorized as a whiskey from a pot still, but I don't think so. You can make a single grain from a column still. Column still is always, a bit sad to be, less of character. Doesn't necessarily have to do that, because in a professional column still you can change so much. You can replicate almost any distillation that you would have within a pot still, but pot still is just more romantic and cool. Yeah, so much for the grain, either blended grain or single grain. Here we have a blended grain. I'm not quite sure if this is really a blended grain or if they just wrote blended grain on there. That was it for the Scotch whiskey. So basically you have single malt, blended, and grain whiskey, and a bit of a specialties there. That is the main ones. The high class is to be considered the single malt. You can have really good blended malts and really good grain whiskies, but everybody really goes for the single malt. Next up is the Irish whiskies. Irish whiskies are written differently to the Scotch whiskies. There is a long story about how the Irish said, oh yeah, all the stuff from Scotland is so poor of quality. That's why we are adding an E to the whiskey. And then we have Irish whiskey. And that's why they spell it with an E. And then everything went downwards for the Irish, and the quality for Irish went downwards with them. So now the whiskey is not considered as good as the whiskey. So it really backfired for these guys that tried to distinguish themselves from Scotland. Yeah, and in Scotland, you have to have single malt from a pot still. In Ireland, it's different. You have single malt whiskey and single pot still whiskey. And they really have nothing to do with each other. So you can have a single pot still whiskey that is made partly of grain. It still has to be made on a pot still to be considered single pot still whiskey. If you have a single malt, it can be produced on any still you want. It has to be made from 100% malt. And most of the distilleries tend to write single malt on their label, and a few of them I know they don't even have a column still, so they could call it single malts pots, single pot still whiskey. I don't know, they just write single malt in them, like Tullamore here. I think Tullamore does have a column still as well, but let's say the Teeling I had a few, it's gone. The Teeling I had was single malt whiskey, but they only have pot still. So they could write single pot still whiskey on it, but everybody could say, yeah, then you're using grain. No, you don't. So yeah, bit different, bit more specific, I would say, because they don't mix in the malt with the pot still, but also not as restrictive and not as quality assuring here. Then we do have the blended and the grain within the Irish whiskey industry as well, but I'm not quite sure if there's a grain out there currently for the Irish whiskey. There's probably a grain out there somewhere, some cheap grain, some at some supermarket, but the blended Irish whiskey is really big. Here we don't have really written blended Irish whiskey on the bottle, but they have it here, finest blend. Oh yeah, they do. Oh yeah, finest blended Irish whiskey, but they write it really, really small. Triple distilled, trademark Bushmills. It's not much a difference to the Scottish whiskey. Not quite sure if they have different laws, because in Scotland you do also have restrictions on your cask, and I think they're a bit more loose in Ireland. So we leave the old continent and go over to America. In America we have something called bourbon. And back in the days, the bourbon came from the Bourbon country. The Bourbon country was a small county. They call it counties. Yeah, the Bourbon county within Kentucky. And the Bourbon county within Kentucky, it was very, very south of Kentucky. They now call it Faraday County, not quite sure. And back in the days, they named it Bourbon County in honor of the King of France, who helped the Americans win the War of Independence, because the Americans really could win the war by themselves on their continent. They would have dragged on a bit longer, though, without the help of the French. They really couldn't defeat them on the sea, because the Royal British Marines, or the Marine Navy, the Royal British Navy was just unbeatable at the time. Unbeatable, but an alliance between the Americans and the French could beat them. So the King Bourbon, the House of the Bourbon, got an honor, and the county was called Bourbon, and the best whiskey came from the Bourbon County and was called Bourbon. It was then so popular in Kentucky that everybody tried to cling on to the name, and suddenly every bourbon came from Kentucky, and later it got extended to the whole United States, and now everybody in the United States can produce a bourbon whiskey. So to be able to call it a bourbon whiskey, you have to have at least 50% corn or 51% corn, so made a majority of corn, and has to be matured in new oak, charred oak barrels and containers, not barrels, containers, and some other restrictions as well, but not really hard restrictions. So everybody in the United States can make a bourbon whiskey that is primarily made of corn. But not everybody in America wants to make a bourbon whiskey, and that leads us to Tennessee. But let me finish the bourbon, because Kentucky, still proud state of Kentucky, want to make their own style of whiskey when they lost the bourbon to the whole city, not whole city, the whole country. So now the whiskey is not just called a bourbon, but it's called a Kentucky straight bourbon. To be a Kentucky straight bourbon, you have to have a bit more strict laws. So Kentucky, it has to be from the state of Kentucky, distilled and matured there. So I think you can buy the corn from somewhere else, but it has to be distilled and matured in the state of Kentucky. When matured, I'm not quite sure. Not quite sure about bottled either. So I think the bottling can be done outside as well. But then there's the word straight. There is straight whiskey, and straight whiskey has age restrictions. I think it has to be more than 2 years of age, and it has to come from one distillery. So to be you can have a mixture of bourbon and still call it bourbon, but if you want to have a straight bourbon, you have it from one distillery. So Kentucky Straight Bourbon, Maker's Mark, comes from the Maker's Mark distillery, which is in Frankfort, Kentucky. It is more than 2 years old. It's 3 years old and a bit more even. I think it's 5 to 6 years old or something like that. And so this is what the definition of Kentucky Straight Bourbon is. Straight bourbon can come from any other state and has to be still from one distillery and 2 years of age. And this is all written down in the ATF, the not American Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms Code of Law, Title 5, Section 27, subsection something. I don't know. It's law. It's boring. And then we have these guys who don't want to produce bourbon. And that goes back to a guy called Jack Daniels. Jack Daniels whiskey is not a bourbon. There are t-shirts that are sold at the Jack Daniels distillery where it says Jack Daniels, not the bourbon. Because it's Tennessee whiskey. And in Tennessee, they have laws for making Tennessee whiskey. And Tennessee whiskey, the laws are very, very similar to bourbon. So if you would have a Tennessee whiskey, you could name it a bourbon. You don't want to, but you could name it a bourbon. But you can't name a bourbon a Tennessee whiskey because you have to do something additional. And that is a charcoal filtration. You have to produce charcoal somehow and then filter your raw distillate through that charcoal and then mature it in charred oak barrels for at least something and code of law, very similar to bourbon. And that is called the Lincoln County process, named after the Lincoln County. And there are only 2 distilleries in Tennessee that are a bit bigger. There's a third one, but I'm not sure if they stick to a Lincoln County process. And they do all say they have different ways of maturing doing their Lincoln County process. One does it cooled, one does it dripping, and one fills it up and let it store there. And so it's really a battle between George Dickel and Jack Daniels. Which one is better? You can't tell because they're really good both. The Jack Daniels, the really good Jack Daniels are really good whiskeys. Only the normal one, it's still a good whiskey, but it's a high drinking whiskey. So that is Tennessee whiskey. Basically, a bourbon plus the Lincoln County process is Tennessee whiskey, and of course, matured and made in Tennessee. Then we have the old whiskeys from America. Whiskey making in America started, with the 13 colonies, and was Pennsylvania one of the 13 colonies? But it really started booming in Pennsylvania. Yes, it did. Because I have to make that silence. And it started in the 13 colonies. And in Pennsylvania, they really could grow the rye. So the rye was the grain that was best suited for the plains of Pennsylvania and the harsh, cold winters. I think it's about the winters or something. So they had plenty of rye, and they couldn't possibly eat so much rye. So what they did is they made whiskey. So there were a lot of whiskey distilleries in Pennsylvania, and they made rye whiskey. And that's the other big type of whiskey within the United States. You have the bourbon and the Tennessee, which is similar, similar in style, and then you have the rye whiskey, which is totally different because rye as a grain is very, very spicy. When you try a rye whiskey, it's fresh, it's spicy, it's just very intense. And rye whiskey has to be made 50% least rye and yada 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 with the new age oak something, and yeah, and it's really an amazing product when you taste it straight or with water, because it's so intense. I took the gunfire because it's one of the really hard types, and it's matured also after the new oak charred barrels in sherry cup. No, this is the other one. There was another one with sherry. This is the normal one. It's a double cask. It's just matured in two type of casks. And that's not it with the Americans. You have your bourbon, rye, and your Tennessee, and then you have everything else. You can make whiskey out of any grain. It's corn whiskey has to have, I think, 70% corn. Then you have oat, 51% oat, millet, at least 51% millet, and 51 wheat. And you can also have a single malt for malted barley. I think Woodford, I'm not quite sure what's in there again. Oh yeah, it's 100% malt spirit matured in used cooper. So it's kind of a homage to the Scotch whiskey. And so yeah, you can produce a single malt. Here they call it a classic malt. What is also very interesting in America is they took the Irish spelling, the whiskey, because when the whiskey was really great, the Americans started making whiskey. So the Irish were dominant above the Scottish. Now the Scottish are dominant above the Irish. And so the distilleries all made whiskey, except a few of them. Is this one a whiskey or whiskey? This is a whiskey. So when you look at Jack Daniels or Jim Beam, they all make whiskey, except Maker's Mark, and I'm not quite sure, I think George Dickel as well. And that's just because these guys were of Scottish descent. So most of the people who started distilling in America were of German descent, but they connected with the Irish more and tried to imitate the Irish. That's why they called it whiskey. And there are a lot of Irish guys as well. And some of the guys were Scottish, and they called it whiskey. Yeah. What did they do at Woodford? They call it whiskey. There's everybody except these few guys. So these were the big type of whiskies. The Scotch, the Irish, and the American. And now here we have international whiskies, and I'm missing a Canadian whiskey. Shame on me. Canadian whiskey. Let's talk about Canadian whiskey, even though I don't have a Canadian whiskey here. Canadian Club, Irish Mist. What's the guys from Gimli, Crown Royal, and they have different laws. The problem with Canadian whiskey is you're allowed to put artificial flavor in it. That's what I really don't like about the Canadian whiskey. So be careful about the Canadian whiskey. Most of the good Canadian whiskeys that you know, they don't do that. They don't mess around with any flavor, but they could. And they could do it without telling you. So, I don't know. And then we have international whiskey. International whiskey is not really defined that well. You have biggest Canadian whiskey, then the biggest whiskey makers in the world are India. But their definition of whiskey is not as consistent with whiskey with us. So with their whiskey, you could actually put something we would call rum in it. So it's a mixture of whiskey and rum. There are two really good distilleries in India. It's Amrut and Paul John. They don't mess around with that stuff. They don't mess around with the sugar canes or the molasses. So they do single malt. And you can be sure if you get an Amrut whiskey and it's single malt on it, then there's only malted barley in it, and it's made in a really good way, and it follows the legislation of Scotch whiskey, except it's not made in Scotland. And yeah, most of the countries really cling on to the big juggernaut of our time, the Scotch whiskey. The Japanese whiskey really started in 1924 or something, where a guy called Yamasaka Taketsuru went to Scotland and learned the trade of making whiskey and came back and brought the knowledge back, and they started making whiskey at Suntory and then later at his own plant, Yoichi, and now it's Nikka and Miyagikyo. He also made Miyagikyo, or was it their sons that made Miyagikyo? And the whiskey in Japan has pretty much the same legislation as in Scotland, but the mentality and the idea behind behind Japanese whiskey is different. When you see in Scotland the single malt, when you look at here at the back, there's always a lot of single malt there. They don't do single malt. This is a typical Scotch whiskey, a typical Japanese whiskey, and it's a blended Japanese whiskey. So with their idea is that you create ingredients from different distilleries, from different stills, and from different sources, and then you blend these flavors together in the perfect balanced whiskey. So their idea of perfection must be a blend because it must be well balanced and has a lot of ingredients. So that's why you see a lot of blended whiskey within Japan. The normal single malt Scotch connoisseur thinks, oh, blended, usually bad. In Japan, that's a sign of perfection. Then we have whiskey from, where's McMurray in Sweden. They pretty much follow the Scottish path. And then we have single malt from St. Kilian, which is from Germany near Frankfurt. And in the end, we have the M&H whiskey from a distillery in Tel Aviv. And when you have international whiskey, the first thing you should think about is, what's the country like? What's the country in terms of climate like? Because that is very important for the maturation of the whiskey. When you have Sweden, it's very similar to Scotland as in climate, maybe a bit more harsh because it has less of the Gulf Stream in there, and a bit colder, so it's very slow maturing and very, not very additive maturing as you would look at thing from Kentucky. And the next one, Germany, is medium, somewhat like Scotland, but with hotter summer. So it's a mixture between the fast maturation of the southern countries and the northern slow maturation. And then you have the M&H. So I picked them like northern, medium, and southern country. And Israel, with the M&H distillery, is a southern country. It's a desert country. It's really, really, really hot there. They say they have 3 seasons, hot, hot, and hottest. And that's where the whiskey is stored really in a hot climate, where there is a lot of evaporation going on, a lot of exchange of flavors between the wood and the spirit, and that means it really matures additive. So there's a lot of wood influence in it, but it still might have a little bit of a metallic youth in it. So the maturity of a well-rounded and no edges whiskey, like from a very, very old Scottish whiskey or old northern country whiskey, you don't find that in the southern whiskies. But the southern whiskies, they become really fast, really oaky and sweet, and all the flavors from the cask. So the maturation is really what is the difference between the countries. And most of the countries follow the Scottish way of distilling. So, have I finally found the end? Hopefully I didn't forget any type of whiskies. Yeah, if you buy that last train of thought, if you buy any whiskey in India, not from Paul, John, or from Amrut, or maybe there's another good distillery coming up, really take a look at them, because if they're not well matured, they might as well be fresh whiskey. You don't have to mature a whiskey in India to have it. So yeah, there might be coloring in there. Yeah. Oh, I could have said about something about that. Coloring of whiskey is also a very interesting topic, because most of the countries allow coloring of their whiskey. There are a few exceptions. I'm not quite sure about America, because America was said, yeah, bourbon is never colored, best whiskey. I think you're allowed to do that now, but the Americans don't really need to color their whiskey. Or they don't need to color the bourbon. Whiskey in America, probably also colored, but not the bourbon. Yeah, so yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for watching. If I forgot any types of whiskey, write down in the comments, and we'll have a discussion and find out the specialities about that type of whiskey. So this was it. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.